The psychological concept of sensation and perception explores how we get the world inside our brains and what our brains do with the information they receive. In a world of constant stimulation, from everything we see with our eyes to the sensations our bodies feel, the brain has a large responsibility to help our minds understand everything that is happening around us. Sensation is the mind's window to the outside world. It is the process of detecting, converting, and transmitting raw sensory information from our sense organs, such as our eyes, ears, and tongue, which use the information they take in to help the brain understand what is happening. The sensations we feel go hand in hand with the perception of the brain, which works to process the information. Perception is how the brain gives meaning to sensory information by selecting what is important, organizing, and interpreting the information into patterns. The process all begins with receptor cells, which are found in all of our sense organs. When a stimulus, which can be anything from a person's voice in your ears to a smell when you enter a room, is detected by one of these organs. For example, a bright light hitting our eyes sends neural impulses to the brain to help understand what is occurring and how the brain needs to adjust to protect itself from the stimulus. This process is called transduction. Our brain then perceives the information to select, organize, and interpret what has occurred in a process called coding, which occurs in different parts of the brain. Not unlike a computer, the brain categorizes stimuli into different parts interpreted as distinct sensations. Our brain interprets this information every time you hear, see, touch, taste, smell, or feel anything, and it can occur simultaneously and in seconds. With all of this stimulation, the process of sensory reduction can help us to analyze sensations before they are sent to the brain, which is used as a filtering system to help the brain decide what sensations are important to focus on. People with autism spectrum disorder, for example, have difficulty with this process, which can have a big impact on the way that they live. In psychology, we also study people who have disabilities in order to see how a person with little to no use of a particular sense, such as Helen Keller, who lacks the ability to see and hear, perceives the world compared to a person who can do these things. A common misconception about the way our bodies and minds sense and perceive stimuli is that there are only 5 senses. In addition to taste, which can also be referred to as gustation, smell or olfaction, vision, and hearing, our bodies and minds work together with senses such as the vestibular sense, which is the sense of balance, and kinesthesis, which provides information about bodily posture, orientation, and the movement of individual body parts. But how do we extract the important messages from the sensory data? Our brains also use a process called sensory adaptation to help filter out repetitive information and reduce responsiveness to unchanging stimuli. For example, imagine you walk into someone's house and are suddenly hit by an influx of a horrible smell. To you, it may seem overwhelming, but the person who has been living with this scent has reduced the responsiveness to the scent because they have lived with it for so long. This adaptation happens with all sense organs except our eyes because of their constant movement, and can be both dangerous and an important skill for survival. The brain has the ability to pay attention to some stimuli and not others. Examples of this include selective attention, where you only respond to specific messages, such as when you are in a busy room and you aren't paying attention to the individual conversations people are having, but if someone calls your name across the room, you react. Your brain knows that certain stimuli, such as the sound of your name, is important and therefore pays attention to those sounds. Another interesting example is habituation, which contributes to the selection of stimulus where an unchanging or boring stimuli is ignored. This often contributes to difficulty in long-term relationships when someone chooses to react to a more exciting stimuli of someone new rather than their current old news partner. Other animals also contain this ability to respond only to certain sensory information. An example of this is seen in feature detectors, specialized neurons in the brain which respond to important stimuli. A frog, for example, could have certain feature detectors that see the flying bugs around them. What is particularly interesting about this concept is how both sensory adaptation and habituation can be used together in our everyday lives in the form of advertising. Advertising companies keep in mind the way our brains process information when selling products. In this advertisement, visual stimulation, intensity of colors, and fast movement is used to keep consumers from becoming bored and unresponsive. This may seem like an obvious advertising technique. However, without the psychological knowledge of how our brains react to visual stimulation, it would not be so apparent. But how do we process this constant stream of incoming information? And do everyone's brains react the same? The simple answer to this question is no. There are various ways to process information. An example of this is top-down versus bottom-up processing. Bottom-up processing is perceiving information as parts and assembling them together as a whole. An example of this is children learning to spell. They would sound out L-E-A-R-N, taking each letter as a part and putting it together to read learn as a whole. Top-down processing is used for people with a higher level of cognitive processing, moving from whole into parts. An example of this could be a person looking at a diagram of a piece of furniture to decide how it would come apart and then put the pieces together to create a whole. Perhaps the most interesting skill our brain and bodies have is the ability to cope with extreme pain. Perception varies from person to person, which means that the feeling of pain is relative, and no two people are impacted the same way by a painful accident, because our brains have different ways of suppressing types of pain. There are two theories of how our bodies deal with pain. The first is the release of endorphins. Upon impact or injury, our bodies can release natural painkillers called endorphins, which are neurotransmitters that act in the same way as morphine. These endorphins inhibit pain perception by temporarily stopping the signal from crossing the synapses. The second theory is called gate control theory, which occurs when pain sensations are processed and altered by mechanisms within the spinal cord. Perception of pain in this case depends on whether or not the neural message can get past the gatekeeper in the spinal cord. This message can be prevented from passing on and creating a painful impact by either distraction of the person feeling the injury, by removing their focus from the pain, by rubbing the injury, or hearing positive messages from other people. This is why having your friend make you smile or laugh when you're in pain can help you heal. The brain can also generate pain from stimuli that isn't even there. An example of generated pain is phantom pain, which happens when people lose their limbs and feel as though the limb is still attached. Or tinnitus, the constant ringing sensation people can hear in their ears. Although this type of pain is generated by the brain, it can still feel just as painful or discomforting as the pain that our bodies produce. Now that we know more about sensation and perception and how our brains process information, another compelling psychological concept attempts to answer the question of how sensory data is organized in our brains. There are many theories as to how this data is sorted. A widely known theory, for example, is the Gestalt theory. According to the Gestaltists, our brains do not organize sensory data as parts, but rather as separate entities organizing the whole stimulus into various patterns. An illusion can demonstrate how this theory works in a variety of ways. When a false or misleading perception that does not agree with our sensations is shown to a person, there are many different explanations as to which principle of putting together the pattern is used by the brain. The following images are examples of illusions that are explained by this theory. The first image represents the principle of figure ground, which explains a perception where the ground is seen as further away than the image. Our brains can perceive this as a black face or two white faces looking at each other. This is because it is so vague as to which part of the image is the background and which is the object. Because no two people will perceive an image the same, illusions can be seen in different ways, but all illusions are designed to trick our minds. The next image is called the Knizia triangle, which shows a principle of the Gestalt theory called closure. According to this principle, objects are grouped together to form a whole by filling in the gaps to make the image appear cohesive. You can see two triangles. Although neither is filled in completely, your brain can infer the lines that are not there. Continuity explains how our brains use patterns to view an image. Although it is obvious that the man does not have a cat for a beard, it appears this way because the image is seen as continuous. Similarity shows that objects are grouped together to form images. In this image, you can see that the circles are formed together to make a triangle because similar shapes are pieced together to appear as a whole. The last principle of this theory is proximity, which states that our perception can see two separate objects as one when the image is perfectly aligned to allow the elements to group together. This reduces the needs for our brain to process a smaller number of stimuli rather than one large picture. Through learning about how our bodies and brains work together to sense and perceive even the most stimulating environments, I am fascinated by the amazing and seamless ways the brain reacts to stimuli. Even when you are sitting and doing nothing, your body and mind are always working together to help it take in the world around you. All thanks to your good friends, sensation and perception.